So when we talk about sheltered workshops, that's kind of a euphemism for a segregated place where only people with disabilities come to work. And the way it works is, regardless of where they live, whether they live with their family or a foster home or a group home or in an apartment on their own, folks with disabilities would come to that central location in some way. A bus might pick them up, they might take the bus in, their family might bring them in, whatever. And they would be in a building, like a warehousey, typically kind of building. Work would be brought into that setting. The people would perform the work, and then the work would be returned to the business. So there'd be no contact between the business necessarily and the folks with disabilities who are performing the job. And there are examples, actually, of pretty good shelter workshops around the country, you know, that look nice and that where people get paid fairly decently. But the typical shelter workshop, only a few people might be working. Some people would be considered too disabled to work, so they kind of get left out of that process. Folks that got paid in settings like that typically got paid a sub-minimum wage, so they get paid on a piece rate. And again, the presumption is that the productivity of a person with disabilities would be so much lower than a person without disabilities that we had to figure out some mechanism for paying them appropriately, or the business would never want to hire them. So we did that, so they were paid sub-minimum wages. But the big deal in the end, two things. One is the segregation, and secondly is the wage. The first part being segregation. I think in the beginning we assumed that that was a good idea because, again, we didn't know how people were going to really behave in job settings. Employers were not ready to hire people with disabilities in 1980, 85 for the most part. I mean, it was a rarer employer that might do something like that. So the real issue for me personally was the segregation and the fact that I'd seen a different reality. There were organizations around the country. There weren't very many. They tended to be small. They tended to be university-based, but they were developing jobs in regular community businesses. And it wasn't restricted to large cities. The very first presentation about supported employment I ever saw was from a guy who was from rural, the Northeast, I can't remember if it's Vermont or Maine, but he was developing jobs in cities the size of Prospect and Gold Hill and Rogue River. And that's where he was especially focused. So it was, you could do it anywhere. You could do it in very small settings as long as people were open and willing to give it a shot. So I'd seen that happen, and I just got frustrated with the fact that Oregon had spent 8 years and all this training money and gotten all this, people wound up and whatnot about this strategy that I thought was going to change the world. And I ended up resigning my job at the county, taking the job at Living Opportunities specifically to make that happen. And very committed to the idea because I'd seen it work. And I'd also, most importantly, I think, I'd seen it change people's lives. Suddenly people had new things to talk about. They had more things to talk about. They talked about the bus ride to work. They talked about meeting new friends. In this new job setting. They talked about the funny stories that their coworkers, you know, just all the things that we do in the social kind of network place that we call a job. They were bringing that home to their families, and that experience was changing their family's mind. You know, I mean, parents were a little skeptical. They hadn't seen this happen before. It was changing the mind of employers because employers were watching this work in the middle of their own business. It was changing our staff's mind. You know, the folks that weren't on board yet were seeing this happen and seeing this change people's lives. So it was really easy to stay committed to the idea. It was less easy to actually make it happen over time for a number of reasons. One is, again, the payment system didn't change, the rule system didn't change. They were all built for shelter workshops, segregated workshops, where one staff person with 8 people with disabilities would be, operating. And especially the payment system. At some time when you run out that, after you get the 60th job, the payment system stops working. It just, we couldn't make it work anymore. It's one of the reasons we started fundraising. It's the primary reason we started fundraising, is that we could not continue to develop jobs at that level. But I don't want to just focus on jobs, because I think exactly the same thing is true for where people live. And again, the very first year I worked at Living Opportunities, I got to meet a woman. Her name was Gail. She was from Madison, Wisconsin, and she was taking people out of group homes at that point in time, people with very significant disabilities and behavioral issues, and placing them in apartments. And they were being successful. And so we came back and started thinking about, well, should we continue as an organization that's going to create a lot of group homes, or should we be an organization that's going to do that because at some level that's, necessary?